Okay, this is SIG Network Policy API sub-project meeting. Today is November 16. This is an official meeting, so please be nice with each other and let's get started. Today we have an agenda here. I'm gonna share my screen as soon as I find the button. Yeah, okay, application window, great. Okay, great. So we have a small agenda here. Let's pass through the cap reviews and see if someone is missing something. Jay, do you want to start with yours?
Oh man, synthetic labels. What's the deal with the synthetic labels? I keep hearing about them, but nobody wants to tell me what they are. I mean, I was thinking about it, I was playing around with it. I think, well, it makes sense. Like if you just put, in my mind, the stupid way of doing this is, well, if you just put an annotation on a damn network policy that said allow all traffic from these namespaces, that would solve 80% of the problems I would care about. Obviously, that's too hacky. So then something slightly less hacky would be if you just had a way of, if you could just put a label that was an invalid Kubernetes label that, somehow or something using some secret, syntax, and then you could look that label up, but it wouldn't necessarily be a part of other predicates, and it wouldn't be included as a normal label. So clients that knew about that secret Easter egg could go use it. Well, then you could have a way that clients could, I don't know.
Yeah, I saw you answering some of Tim's reviews and some of them reviews. Were them related also to virtual labels and synthetic labels? What was that about? I don't know if it's
I mean, synthetic labels don't have, so there's a special case that Tim brought up. And so, okay, let's start from the top. So there's a bunch of stuff in the reviews, but there's only one really interesting thing to talk about, which is everything else is pretty much addressed, I think, or it's just, some polishing it off. But Tim brought up this question of like, well, if we add so let's think about the way the peers work, policy peers work, right? There's 3 primitives inside of a policy peer: pod selector, namespace selector, IP block. And the idea is that the more of those primitives you switch on, the more restrictive the policy, right? So if I turn on pod and namespace selector, I have a more restrictive policy than if I just turn on the pod selector in general, right? All things being equal. So now if you add a 4th switch, okay, to there, right? Then you get this weird thing where if you have a pod selector and you have a namespace selector by name, namespace selector by name, then you have now made a very, very specific policy. But if a client that doesn't understand the namespace by name selector reads that policy, the client is going to interpret a looser security model. So then, okay, what Tim said was, yeah, okay, so I think there's a premise in his argument that he didn't state, that I'm assuming, which is that he doesn't like that it's better maybe to it's better for a client that doesn't know about some specific API construct to interpret that construct by default in such a way that the output policy is more restrictive than less. Okay, so how does this lead to virtual labels? The way it leads to virtual labels is that a virtual label doesn't have the same drawback because it's not inserting itself into one of the primitives of the existing peer policies. So because it's not being inserted in there, if you were to select only on these virtual labels, you would always if a client didn't understand what one of those virtual labels was, it would never make a policy that was more open than what the user originally intended, I guess.
I got it, because they are going to have like a namespace selector that it is not aware of it, right? So it's saying, okay, you have a namespace selector with no namespace, so I'm blocking everything.
Yeah. I mean, I had to
Okay.
think through this for like an hour and a half before it made sense to me. Like I had to think, because didn't understand what he meant by virtual labels. So I kind of had to like reverse engineer the definition of it from the consequence that he was stating as the output of the whole thing. And then it all kind of made sense. So I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like it's just, I don't know. I feel like that's what I'm tending towards, but I don't want to say that like, I don't think that the namespace as name thing that we should do it, but I feel like for me, I'm going to explore this virtual labels thing. But I do welcome anybody who's interested in that conversation or in the other conversation around how we can back out of that problem. And he did have a potential solution to that, which is that in the case that you have a namespace by name selector, you also have a pod selector inside of the namespace by name selector, so that the entire definition of namespace selector is a self-contained thing, and you either get it or you don't. And if you don't ever combine it with the other pod selector, and so you don't have that weird thing. But I feel like that's just very ugly. Like that's making the network policy API as a whole worse to have that other solution. Then I wanted to ask, but I didn't really ask because I'm assuming Tim would have thought through this, right? So I'm assuming he thought about this. It just feels to me like maybe there's a solution around how the API translates and negotiates API versions between the client. I mean, there's got to be some way that we can have some surgery that we do at the API server level where we say, well, if you're a 1.16 client and you see a policy with a network namespace by name in it, then we're always going to send you like some default that's highly secure. So I feel like on a case-by-case basis, it seems like you could do some kind of translation surgery. I don't know.
I think this is also related to Dan Winship cap, right? Because I think he has put in his cap about what happens if you have a field that the CNI doesn't understand. So when he says that he wants to put like a minor version, he's saying something like, "Oh, I am announcing that my network policy is this version, and if the CNI thinks that it's not secure enough, I'm going to warn the user, or maybe I'm not going to publish that network policy either."
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I got it.
I mean, I feel like it's very, very strongly related to Dan's thing. I feel like that's why I feel like though the virtual labels wind up getting really interesting, because you might be able to create a bunch of you may be able to solve an entire, what I don't know yet is there a whole class of problems that we can solve with those? Or is it just this one, right? But I feel like there's a class of problems you might be able to solve. I just haven't thought about it a lot. So I got to play with it some more. I got to look into what's going on with this virtual labels thing. I just don't think we can avoid it. I mean, the thing is though, what I asked him was, why is it so important? So this is the other interesting question, is why is it, I understand in general why you would want a policy that didn't know about a field to have a more strict version of that policy, if nothing else. But it's like, I don't know whether it's 100% clear that that's the default interpretation that he had. I'm kind of reverse engineering that from what he said. So to me, the fact that this is not backwards compatible in the purest sense, and that old clients are going to have some weird interpretation of your policy, I just don't think that's the end of the world. Like, I feel like that's not that necessarily a deal breaker, but I think he was implying that it might be. So that's the other thing. So I have to hear back from him on that, I think. I hope, but the thing is that my answer was so long and I answered it in 3 parts that I don't know if he's going to have time to read it. So I may just have to bring it up in SIG Network next week. Anyways, that's all I got. I'm just going to take up
Is there some
this whole call just talking about virtual labels to myself, if you let me.
to like taking the short path? Is there some sort of validation that we could do? Like if you define a namespace selector by name, you should also define a namespace selector by label, even if it's empty. So you are going to warn non-aware clients that you have a namespace selector, but that's empty, so it's not going to select anything. Like, can we do this kind of validation in the API? Is this something? I'm thinking like in the short path and not in the long path that's virtual labels.
I feel like there's something we can do with the API. I don't, what, can you suggest that again? I just didn't fully process it.
Yeah, like some sort of API validation that when you insert a namespace by name, you should also publish a namespace by label empty, or I don't know if they are mutual exclusive, but some sort of warning or an error to the user that, okay, you are defining namespace by name, so because of compatibility, you need to also specify a namespace selector by label. So other CNIs are going to know that you have like a namespace that's a selector that's empty, so it's not going to select anything because you don't have any label selector in the namespace selector. Some sort of giving users a warning in the API side that, or even an error that this might be prone to
So you're
some
not
sort
allowed,
of.
so then you make the namespace selector by name have a complementary relationship with namespace by label. And then anytime you submitted a namespace by name, you also had to at least submit one label, even if the label was a garbage label.
Yeah.
And then that label would never be selected.
Or submit it empty if you don't have anything.
Yeah. Well,
it's definitely doable.
What's that?
Definitely doable. Like in validation, you can force that you can add validation so that a client has to provide both fields.
And
yeah.
Yeah, and if it was a garbage field, so you say, okay, XYZ colon 1 2 3 is a label selector. You know that that's never going to be selected.
Well, and so what Ricardo was saying is like, it doesn't have to be a garbage field. Like it can be the actual empty selector.
Well, yeah, but what's the advantage of that? It's just that it selects
the advantage is that you explicitly opt, like you're forcing users in the API to they have to explicitly say empty label or empty selector, as opposed to like having to put some like dummy label in there that has no semantic meaning.
Oh, so yeah, I mean, it forces people who are writing the policy to sort of be more explicit, but it doesn't fix the problem of a client.
Or can we mutate the API, the object, Andrew? Like when you submit a match namespace, we also mutate the API object, so it might have like an empty namespace selector if you don't have namespace selector. Can this mutation be possible also in the API, or this is just a validation side?
Yeah, that could work too. So I think one clarifying question for me, does specifying an empty namespace selector mean all namespaces or no namespaces?
If it has no labels in it, then it'll by default match any namespace. So the only real value is if you specify a label. In my opinion, I think the only thing that's valuable is if you actually have garbage data in your namespace selector, because then you'll be able to block the select all, which I think is the behavior that Tim was suggesting. I don't see any value in, it's not that I don't see value in it. I just don't think it solves the specific problem that Tim was suggesting. I think it seems like Tim was suggesting we want things to be more secure, not less, in the case that we don't understand the namespaces field. So if you have an empty label selector, then
yeah. So I think we need to clarify that. Because I think what Ricardo was saying is that if you have an empty label, if you have an empty namespace selector, it defaults to no namespaces. So it by default would be more secure because you force a user to put in, or you even mutate it on the back end. But yeah, like I'm reading the docs now, and I think an empty namespace selector means all namespaces, right?
Yeah, I've just sent to you. I was reading either. It's if present but empty, it selects all namespace. So yeah.
Yeah.
Jay's right on that.
So if it's empty, it selects all, but if it's nil, then it's also basically selecting all. So empty and nil are basically the same thing. It's the same logical intersection. And so the only, but I mean, the garbage data thing would solve the would simulate the exact behavior that Tim is suggesting. Now, here's a question for you. Is there a canonical way that you can think of to like put a label that will never be selected into a policy? I mean, that would be weird though, right? But if you did that, you would actually be able to have that backwards compatible thing, right? So somebody puts in a namespace's name. So now the API server then puts like some huge auto-generated time-stamped.
So one clarifying point, Jay, if the namespace selector is nil, it defaults to the current namespace, not all namespaces.
Oh, hold on.
But I think the point is still valid. Like you don't want the current namespace either.
Hold on. If the namespace selector is nil and I have policy that selects traffic from pod A, then you're saying pod A from namespace Y won't be able to get in? I could have sworn I've tested this.
I didn't follow you there, but if you look at the docs for pod selector,
okay,
the note about if the namespace selector, it says, if namespace selector is also set, then the network policy peer as a whole selects the pod matching pod selector and the namespace selected by namespace selector. Otherwise, it selects the pods matching pod selector and the policy's own namespace.
But you can use an expression. You can have like a namespace selector and have a match expression that doesn't match anything, right? Like
yeah.
So this is also like a way, Jay.
Yeah, that would do it. If there's a good, clean way to do a match selector that doesn't match anything for namespaces as a default, that would solve Tim's specific problem.
Yeah, so instead of matching labels, you can match an expression. And if you have like a match expression with a key and like a does not exist with like a random key, or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, is there a good way to do that though?
I don't know.
Like, if you are
going to do that, we probably want like to define a Kubernetes namespace label that is reserved, like specifically for this.
Is that a reasonable thing to do?
I don't know. I don't even know if the match expression thing is reasonable yet. I'm thinking about it a bit more, but I think that would be better than like a timestamped label or something, right? You have one well-known namespace. You have one well-known label reserved for match expressions that have to fail, and users should not use it.
But are they both so unreasonable that we should even? Is the question, right? Like,
yeah, I don't know.
One might be relatively better than the other, but is either one reasonable, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm
interested in finding out. Yeah,
I think it's more doable than virtual labels, though. I don't know if you want that in the API, though.
Yeah, that's the thing. Okay. So what's your take on the virtual labels? Because I just am starting to figure them out. I'm going to read about them more this week and try to do some history and figure out who started talking about them when and what the purpose was and all that. But what's your take on it? Opinion, if nothing else.
I don't have one yet, but I think Ricardo's suggestion is not crazy. Like if you set a namespace by name field, the API strategy will force a namespace selector that does not match anything. That way, an old client will reject all namespaces. And in the validation, you can also make namespace names and namespace selector mutually exclusive so that a user can't set both.
Yeah,
it's pretty sane.
Do one of you guys want to leave that suggestion in that comment thread and see where it goes?
I can do that.
I'm not
Yeah,
against it. I'm not strongly for it, but I'm not against it either. Like it feels to me like it's going to be another rat hole because we're going to I just don't see how that ends in a way that we have something better than what we have. I don't know. But I'm all for it. If Tim agrees to it, I'm all for it. Like I'm happy for that to be the future of the CAP.
Yeah, I can do that, Jay.
Okay.
And if I miss something, I will ping you in. I will ping you, Andrew, in Slack, so you can take a look. Because what Andrew said is that we might also have like a reserved label in the common. What was the name that was common known label, something like that. So you can define that in a file saying this is a reserved label and it's only usable inside those kinds of objects.
Yeah.
So I can take a look into that.
Yeah. If you want to leave it, let's see, and then let's see if Tim responds. And if there's no response, then I'll try to look into it sometime this week if I get time. I feel like, yeah, just go ahead and let's start that conversation. I feel like it's gonna. I feel like if we do that, I really like the idea also. So I really like the idea. I just feel like if we do that, I don't immediately see that there's a clean end implementation for it, right? Like we're going to go and reserve this special label, and the label is only used for a backwards compatibility case that we're not even sure we really need to enforce. It just seems like a lot of moving of parts. And I agree that timestamps are also equally weird. I mean, to automatically timestamp a label selector also weird. I feel like they're both. I think the ideal solution would be if we could just be not very backwards compatible and say, look, if you define a namespace's name, we don't really know what older clients are going to do with that, and maybe a less secure namespace. And I think that logically makes sense to me, right? If I have a namespace's name and that's a field that nobody else knows about, then treating that as an empty field, whatever that means, seems like it's, or as a nil field, kind of seems like it's, seems like it's reasonable. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I feel it. I feel like, but Tim did imply that this was a deal breaker. So, but it's really interesting. So I'm kind of happy that it's gone to the point where we actually are actually really talking about how this implementation will look. Do you think we should look more into the virtual labels, Andrew, or do you think it's probably just a distraction?
Up to you. I mean, I don't have opinions about virtual labels, so your call.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to dig into it unless, I don't find anything. At the very least, I think we need to make a reasonable argument about why we can't use them.
I think that
hardest thing is figuring
probably an argument is that when this is available, we can use it. It's not like we are not going to use it, but we are waiting to this be available so we can also use it.
Yeah.
So I don't see like a con point. I just think that like we should propose some short path and see what what Tim and Dan and Casey, they think about that, and okay, this is viable or this is not viable. And assuming their answer is not going to be positive, so we should wait until virtual labels is something, because the label selector is going to comply also with virtual labels, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
Well, we spent 30 minutes on my problem, so let's talk about your problems. Or someone else.
Okay.
Hey,
Yeah,
what's up,
so
Matt and Gobind? It's good to see you all. I don't think Matt's ever been on this call before. And I don't know who Vinay is, but it's good to see you all. So.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, Jay. Let me do a quick introduction. I'm Vinay. I'm one of the, I work at Google. I manage the GKE networking teams, especially in observability and security. So Zhang used to work, and she'd moved to a different group. So I'm decided to start attending these meetings. So yeah.
Cool. And Matt, did you want to do an intro
welcome.
to yourself?
Yeah, hey guys and ladies. Yeah, I'm Matt. I work at Synopsys, and I've been doing a lot of NetPol hacking recently, and you know, applying that stuff at Synopsys as well. So, you know, happy to learn more about this stuff and possibly do some projects here.
Yeah, Matt's been helping a lot with the validation stuff we've been doing. Okay, cool.
So where are we at? Are we at cluster scope policy per the agenda?
I think we still need to go over the port range.
I'm talking with my microphone closed, and I'm sorry.
What
happens a lot.
One quick question while we are on the namespace by name. Sorry, I wanted to interject, but did not get an opportunity. I feel like the reserved labels is going to be a long shot. It's a little hacky. I don't know, or at least I won't say hacky, but at least it's not as clean as I mean an API should be. But that's my opinion. But you know, maybe if others agree to it, that'd be great.
Is it too close to you now? Do you agree with me? And then it's Andrew and Ricardo on one team.
I didn't quite get your stand on it, but at least I feel like it's a little unclean.
It's not clean. I agree, but I'm not against it. I just feel like it would be accepted.
Have you completely shot down Tim's proposal of using the alpha feature gate and doing the validation based on that? I think that's what he suggested towards the end.
Did he?
That was my understanding, that he's proposing that we change the validation logic based on the alpha feature that we introduce, and then after a few cycles we kind of like move to the new validation once it's graduated to beta or part of the scope. I think that was his last statement.
Let me go back there.
If we had another solution, I don't think we've come up with a good one. So. I think that was a different comment though, Abhishek.
No, I think it's the same comment where, you know, the virtual label comment from Dan, and I think Tim had before that, I think it's one of the very first few comments. If you scroll up.
Let's find this mystery comment.
So I just pasted that in the chat window. I was just wondering whether this is a acceptable approach, or to be honest, I have not yet completely thought through this particular proposal.
Where can we find the comment? Because I do remember some comment he made like that, but for some reason I can't see it. I don't know why. Do you see it in there, any, Ricardo?
There is a magic with Control F here. That's here.
Here it is. Yeah, I think this is I think what you were talking about, Abhishek. right?
Yeah. But maybe we can come back to this later once we have more time. I mean, we can go through the rest of the agenda.
Yeah. Anything on your end, Ricardo? What's up with port ranges?
Just waiting for some reviews, Andrew, and then they reached a consensus about the location of port range. So as we have like two adults taking a look into my API, my proposal, I've moved it to Dan's and Andrew proposal to have a port range separated from the port. And I think that's it. So now I am waiting for some more folks review about that. So
Okay.
I don't think there is something else. So I've added some user stories either because Dan asked it. And that's it. Yeah. So wanna move to cluster scope policy. If someone wanna take a look also into this, please take a look and I'm waiting for more feedbacks and more reviews also. So cluster scope and policy. Who wanna talk? Gobin?
Yeah, I can give a quick
Check.
status as to where we are. So I think last week we went through all the user stories or use cases. I think Gobin brought a lot of use cases from his end. We added a few, and basically we went through all those cluster scope administrator policy use cases, and kind of like agreed upon and documented them in our Google Doc. And our next step is to introduce or write templates based on the spec that we are kind of like converging on. And the idea is to first see whether the proposal that we have satisfies all the use cases that were documented. And if not, then how do we solve that? And if yes, is this the right way of doing it? And then poke holes around it. So that's our next step for this week. Gobin, did I miss on anything? Anything that you want to add?
I think that pretty much covers it. We made pretty good progress, and I don't know, my camera is frozen on my local preview. Am I frozen to everyone?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
You look like a gray blob.
A gray blob? Okay, that's not what I see, but okay, fine. I'll just shut it off.
I think there may be something covering your screen, Gobin, or like your camera.
No, I think it's just a Zoom bug. Never mind.
I see the letters GOBIND where I would normally see your face.
Yeah, I see a frozen preview of myself in Zoom, so I guess it doesn't matter. Never mind. So yeah, nothing to add here. What Abhishek said is pretty much spot on. This week we're just going to assess the use cases and apply our policy, like our policy structure that we've come up with against the use cases. See if there's any shortcomings and gaps, fill them in, and then hopefully we'll have a proposal in the next few weeks. Right, Abhishek?
Yeah, I think that's about it from our end.
Yeah.
Of course, I think Thanksgiving will be coming in, so I don't know how much we'll be progressing, but
yeah,
sometime in December.
Yeah.
Did we, Vinay, are you replacing Zhang? Did we lose Zhang, or is she still going to hang out?
No, she's at Google. It's just like, there's been a change of responsibilities, like, so there's, so she's going to be involved in other Anthos and GK related projects. So there's been a reshuffling of people want to move on because they have other projects. So I'll be taking over. So I'll have a couple of new resources joining my group. So, but in the interim, I'm going to be participating in this.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Tell Zhang, thanks for helping us out and everything. Everybody send Zhang a message and thank her for all the work she did helping us get here.
Yeah, I'll do so. Yeah. Thank you. I just enabled my camera. So hi.
Hi.
Okay, let's move on. FKDN proposal. How is this going?
Yes. So I actually redid the proposal doc with the feedback that I'd gotten and the comments, which was awesome, by the way. So I've condensed all of those comments into sort of two proposals. One It's the same document. It has two proposals now. And thanks to Andrew and Rich Renner, they've both been very helpful in sort of bouncing ideas with me and talking through some of the details. And so we put it all together. I think at this point, I feel like we almost have all the details. There's just sort of the implementation, that we need to sort of clarify. Andrew, if you're still on the line, I was curious to know if you and I can sit down maybe one more time and just go over some of the implementation details, or if you want to do it offline.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so should I set another 30 minutes with you? Like we can take it offline? Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I can link the doc in there if people want to have a look at it.
Yeah, you can. I can link again here.
Okay. Let me do that, and then any questions that I can answer if people are here.
I want to take a look into the proposal again to see what you folks are doing.
Yep.
Like, what's the idea? Yeah.
So I just pasted the link in the Slack chat with you, Ricardo. So if you want to pick it up from there, and I can also stick it into the Google Doc. So do that right now.
Here it is. Do you want to pass through it? We have some bunch of time here.
Yeah, we could do that. We could go over this. So effectively, the first proposal is still roughly the same. So nothing changed there. But what I did is I took all the feedback and that it was in the comments, as I said, and came up with a second proposal with the help of Andrew and Rich, and folks from Google, of course. So the idea here is to now propose a different way of doing this, which is doing it through a new CRD. I'm not married to the name, so it could be FQB and network policy or something else. But the idea was to have a new CRD. Primary advantages would be that existing plugins won't have to necessarily have an implementation or have any conflicts with their implementation. This could be pretty much sort of a choice where you could say the advanced like Calico and Cilium can stay on their implementation if they wanted to, and Kubernetes could have its own thing here without really interfering with each other. And also the other advantage is that if you wanted to provide more verbose sort of semantics like denies and stuff like that in this policy, we could, although that's not the proposal, that's not what the proposal is calling out for at this moment. But it does give us that flexibility, that added flexibility of doing things slightly differently and not be stuck in the network policy sort of scaffolding. So those are some of the big advantages. The disadvantage, of course, is that now customers will have to be very conscious about, oh, I have a network policy protecting this workload, and I have an FQDN policy protecting this workload. So they'll have to search both to be very, very comprehensive about their security mindset and auditing and stuff like that. Any questions up until now?
I think one clarifying point that I'd make is that if we are putting this new resource in the networking.kubernetes.io v1 group, we should be clear that it's a new resource, not a CRD, because a CRD implies that when you install core DNS or kubedns, whatever, you install the CRD schema into the API server, and then the core DNS understands how to watch it. I think where we landed, maybe it's still up for discussion, is that this might be better as a first class Kubernetes resource.
Yeah.
Largely because we know that there are only 1 or 2 implementations of DNS, and this API is basically going to cater to those DNS implementations. And because those DNS implementations already have kind of first class support for Kubernetes and is already Kubernetes aware, it would be simpler to just have it watch, have it support this API natively anyways.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with that, but I want to hear the group's sentiments on this. And if we already have consensus on this methodology, then that's great. We can just start moving forward in this direction.
Yeah, I don't have any opposition to that. I think it would be great. Yeah.
And just a little bit more context. I think there's precedent right now where if you want to introduce a new core API, like you start with CRDs, right? We did this for Gateway, like Service v2, and basically that's kind of the thing we do. And this mostly makes sense when you work with APIs like Ingress, where you have hundreds of implementations of the ecosystem. I think that makes a lot of sense because you want to kind of see how people implement that API and go from there. I think with this, knowing that there are like literally just 2 implementations, it makes sense to just start as a first-class API.
That's what I was missing. That's what I didn't understand. Like, I didn't understand, like, who cares? That's what I was thinking. Like, what if you did a CRD? Like, why would it matter? But yeah, that's the reason. Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Sorry, Jay, I might have not fully understood the gravity of your question. So, like, what does that
There's always this thing that's confusing, like Andrew said, right? Like, you never know. So a CRD, right, is, anybody can make a CRD. You can install it into the API server and then it works, right? So there's always been this question in the back of my mind with not only this, but the other ones. It's like, well, what if we just made a new network policy API as a CRD, and then vendors could variably implement it or not implement it, and then we didn't have to be in this. And then our job would be to really help vendors do these implementations until they became a de facto standard and then merged into the API. But I guess what Andrew's saying, which makes sense, is that, yeah, you could always do that, but it's more likely to be a fruitful thing to do a CRD first if you're going to really be innovating a lot in terms of how you implement it and who implements it and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, we only have 2 solutions that we're proposing. So there's not a lot of bandwidth in terms of how it's implemented. I mean, they're not literally hundreds, but I guess, Andrew, there's probably tens, right? There's probably, just to play devil's advocate, there's probably 15 or 20 different ways you might implement this, right? You might implement it somehow in a hypervisor. You might implement it in a CNI. You might implement it in Core DNS. You might implement it using that operator thing, right?
For cluster DNS?
The FQDN policies.
Right, but if we are saying that there is a resource that the DNS server watches to enforce like resolution policy, like that's a cluster DNS data path, right? And like the number of implementations for that is much smaller than the number of CNIs and ingress controllers and like other pluggable things in the Kubernetes ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there's a lot of ways that you would, that's just one part of it though, right? Like watching for that definition is one thing, but then the way that that's implemented, right, is the interesting thing, right? Like you may have a lot of different ways that you would implement the actual policy. So is the inflection point how many different ways you implement the policy, or is the inflection point how many different ways you
I think we would want to design the API based on how we want consumers to use it, right? So like we need to decide, like if we wanted CNI providers to implement it, then maybe this does belong in network policy. If we want the server to implement it, like to me, like a built-in new resource makes sense. So
yeah. Yeah, I think Jade, so what Andrew and I are sort of suggesting here is that if we go with proposal 2, it almost automatically implies the implementation, which is it's going to be in the DNS service, whether that is kube DNS or core DNS or what have you. This proposal 2 is almost suggesting that that's the implementation. Like the DNS service is going to be part of the enforcement perimeter.
Okay. Then what Andrew said really makes a lot of sense then.
Yeah, exactly. And I was a little hesitant about sort of adding a new enforcement parameter, and that's sort of the disadvantage I've called out with this approach, which is now a customer has to be careful or like at least be cognizant of the fact that there is another enforcement point in the stack where a policy could be enforced. But honestly, like given the downside of potentially getting it wrong in network policy because you can be out of sync and your caches are out of date or whatever, and then you have to poll, and I don't know, like for one DNS resolution, it's like 5 requests that you send to the DNS service. Like it could be scaling issues. It just seemed like a lot of overhead that could just be curbed if we implement it inside the DNS service itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion either way. I just okay.
Yeah. But I just wanted everybody to be like, very, very like clear about what we were suggesting, and so that we can develop consensus here. And then if everybody like thinks that this is the right way to do it, then, we can go make the case to kubedns and core DNS and whatnot.
So one quick question, I think you already alluded to it, but I don't know whether you clarified it, is that how does, if you have a conflicting network policy with this FQDN policy, let's say the network policy allows it and the FQDN policy doesn't really allow it, or the other way around, what will be the expectation? What will be the outcome?
How will the network policy allow it? You mean by IP address?
IP blocks, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the question is how is the packet going to be sent out? If you already have the IP address, I guess they're not going to make the FQDN query and they can just go out. Right?
Yeah, so I don't think you're trying to solve the problem of injecting a resolve.conf. I don't think they're trying to solve that problem, Abhishek.
Well, it's not.
No, I think the question is, I guess if I might add, right, I think if you have two conflicting policies, so let's say in the network policy, you specify a specific IP site or block or IP address and say deny or like allow, and then if you have the FQDN policy which says deny, then who takes precedence? Who wins?
I think the proposal here is that like you are controlling how the DNS is going to answer the queries and not how the CNIs are going to block based on the names, right?
Exactly. If you have the IP address, you're going out. This is only locking down the resolution in the DNS layer. So if the DNS says no, you're not allowed access to this, all you're missing is some information about how www.google.com gets resolved to an IP. But if you have the IP address of www.google.com, you're not going to rely on the DNS policy or the DNS service to resolve it, and therefore you can just go out.
I see.
I've put also a suggestion here, Govind, about if this policy is not related to only blocking, but like if we can control how the DNS server is going to answer for that bunch of namespaces. Like if I want to define not an external name service, but something with like I have a remote server that have a defined internal certificate. Mm-hmm. And I wanna control how the DNS server is going to answer the IP for those, like for that namespace.
Sorry, are you talking about whether the policy will be able to lock down internal DNS queries? So like for
about he writing the response. When I do a query, instead of blocking, like FQDN, instead of blocking www.mytrustedwebsite.com, I want to say that it's going to answer in a specific IP or in a specific kind of CNAME. He writing the answer.
It's going to answer in a specific IP. I'm not sure I follow the use case. I'm sorry if I'm missing some details here. What are you trying to do with this kind of a use case? Sorry if I can explain that.
Yeah, imagine that I have like I have a legacy server here, a part of legacy server now, and I have like the KA and the production, all of them with the same name, but with different IPs because they are like isolated in somewhere. I don't know, like inside a VPC or inside a NSX virtual data center. And I have a load balancer for all of them. So I have the same certificate and the same IP and the same certificate, but different IPs, and I want to answer with a different IP. I want to say that instead of going to the returned IP from the DNS, I want to provide the IP that it's going to
see.
For the namespace.
So if somebody makes the query to www.mytrustedwebsite.com, you want to use this policy to, instead of giving it the, say, the default response that the DNS service would have, you want to give it something pre-fed.
Exactly. I want to rewrite it based on the namespace and the.
I think that's scope creep at this point, but it's an interesting use case. Andrew, I don't know if you agree with that statement. I'd be curious to know if you think this is sort of the bread and butter of the policy that we're talking about right now.
I think definitely something to consider for the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ricardo, would you mind just adding a note just in the doc anywhere? I'll clean it up. Oh, you did. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll make sure that this gets at least covered and called out. And if it's like, say, for version 2 of this policy, then happily we'll consider it. I'm sure there will be more requests, but I would love to sort of keep it focused at this moment so we can get this like committed and built.
Yeah, like I think the way I see it is like that sort of behavior is something that you are allowed to do with the Core DNS plugin or like Core DNS features. And this policy is really just saying, can a pod request whatever this, like, can it resolve whatever this thing is going to end up resolving by other plugins or,
Yeah, I can solve that also with host aliases inside the pod specification. That's just a use case here, like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think I'll add like future possibilities as a section to this document, and I'll say like these are the extensions we could consider in the future. But very quickly, I just want to go over the other aspects section that I added here. And this is to really sort of lock down the scope of this policy, because there were some questions around, hey, what about regexes? And is this an L7 policy, or even open up the packet? Like lots of sort of related questions, and I really wanted to define the perimeter of what's included and what's not. So I'll just quickly go over these so we can make sure we're all aligned on this. So only allow semantics. We don't need or want the deny or accept semantics in this case. This is also to prevent any sort of weird oddities with, say, opening up security holes where you deny something, but only a certain subset of the IPs are denied and some other IPs are left open. It's kind of a security hole. So we don't need deny and accept at this point. We can just need allows. Only egress policies, no ingress FQDN. The behavior of this policy is entirely dictated by the cluster's DNS service. So that was sort of the implication here, which is we cannot make any more guarantees than what the DNS service does, and that's the backstop. So IPs reported by the DNS service are the only IPs we need to allow pods to be able to make outbound requests to. No guarantees are made about all IP addresses that the FQDN could potentially resolve to. If a pod somehow gets the IP address of a website that is not known to the DNS service on that cluster, we won't be able to allow connections to that IP address. This failure mode is not a security hole. It's a minor annoyance. The policy enforcement must be completely in sync with the DNS entries at all times. Again, this comes down to the implementation, and if we put it in the DNS service, it becomes true automatically. Policy accepts either full domain names, as shown here, or a wildcard match for the first label, as shown here. Nowhere else can you put a star, and we will not support any other format. General regex and pattern matching is not allowed. And FQDN policy enforcement for cluster local services is a nice to have, but not required at this time. So we're keeping this as sort of a possibility. If we can get it, we can get it. If not, that's fine. Well, and because we already have a way to do this today with never policy, it's just a little inconvenient. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Just one clarifying point on that one. We're saying that we are not going to support like first-class fields for resolving services, but if I manually put in the known cluster domain or cluster DNS for service in the allowed list, like that still works, right?
The known cluster domain, like the full sort of FQDN of that service, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. Like, maybe like if you put the full name of the local service, like the service name.local, cluster.local or whatever, yeah, that could potentially work, and that would be nice to have here.
Oh, so we're saying we're not supporting that for the first pass.
Pardon me?
So you're saying we're not supporting that for the first pass?
I'm just saying that it's a nice to have, although like if this becomes like a sort of a, you know, a blind spot for us going forward, because right now we think it's probably very easy to do, but let's say later we say, oh, but this has this one big gotcha. I'm happy to sort of say, nah, we can do it later.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I don't anticipate there being a gotcha, but who knows? It's software.
Yeah, I can. So just to be clear here, like, so what you're saying is that by default we don't enforce policy on the .cluster.local domains or DNS, because yeah, like we don't know what the unforeseen results of that is.
Right. What I'm saying is, in the scope of this proposal as stands right now, we don't need that functionality, and therefore we won't support it. But if we think that it's pretty easy to do because of the work we've already done for the rest of it, then we can just, you know, snap fit it on.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Any questions on this?
Not from me.
Who can write these policies, or who's the persona that this policy is?
Yeah.
Should be allowed to, like, what are the RBAC things that you've already thought about?
This would be the cluster operator, the cluster administrator, whatever you want to call it. But to be fair, this could be used just like Kubernetes Never Policy.